So today the session will talk about the impact of the pandemic on COVID-19. I'd like to express our solidarity and our thanks through this healthcare groups, education groups, all those first lines in the COVID. There are many provinces are remembering the victims of the COVID. I'd like to thank the thousands and remember the thousands of victims of the pandemic and all those who lost somebody. So our thoughts are with you. This, as I said previously, we're going to talk in which the small PMOs, SMOs, adapted to the and had resilience. Also, we use the annual report that we produced and in collaboration with the research group of Guelph University. So each year, Spur publishes a report that allows us to see what's happening for the SMOs in Canada in different dimensions. This year, we wanted to look at the capacity of adaptation of the SMOs and the capacities of adaptation that they had. So we worked with the Guelph to document the ways in which the SMOs have adapted themselves. So during this day, we're launching officially the report, available in English and French. We'll share with you via the chat before the end of the session the links to this, and we invite you to consult this. 22 SMOs were encountered or talked to, and we had a survey done by the Guelph University on the SMOs. Many people responded to it during the year. So knowing the organizations in this, I have to clarify that some of them were financed by the IMC through the initiatives for the SMOs. Some were financed by FIT. Others worked with private donations. So there are all kinds of organizations here, and in Canada, and French, English groups, English groups, and also different sizes. So small, micro, medium groups to really have a diversity of adaptation, which is different according to the different groups. Now, during this discussion today, you'll have a chance to hear 3 representatives of the SMOs who have participated in this study and will talk to us about different dimensions of their adaptation to this pandemic. They'll share their strategies, their success, their challenges, and we will discuss also with the research team in Guelph, Adaptation. The panelists today are Wendy Fayer, Equity Director for Cause Canada, Lynn Thornton, who is Executive Director of VIDEA in British Columbia, and Shauna Novak, who is Director of CCPO in Ontario. So we're going to start with a discussion with the panelists, and after that we're going to go into small discussion groups to talk among ourselves of how your adaptation and how your programs were adapted, how your staff was adapted to in the context of the COVID.
So I would like to ask you, Andrea, what have been some of the key elements you've learned from this study in terms of SMO's capacity to adapt?
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. And before I answer your question, I want to offer my thanks to you and the whole Spur Change team for the opportunity to collaborate with you on this research. And I also want to offer my thanks to the 22 representatives from SMOs who generously offered their time to participate in the interviews in order to share their experiences. Right. So as Andrea said, the main objective of the report was to understand how the pandemic has impacted SMO adaptation and resilience. And our hypothesis going into the research was that compared to large organizations, we hypothesized that they might have some unique adaptation strategies and forms of resilience. The report highlights findings in 5 thematic areas. And so we started off with our research asking five research questions. And so then the findings themselves kind of reflect those 5 research questions. So I'm going to go through some of the main findings in each of the 5 areas. And this isn't going to be a detailed discussion because I only have 5 minutes, but this will give you the kind of highlights. So the first thematic area was around resource mobilization and fundraising. This was a major theme within the first study that the University of Guelph team conducted back in the summer of 2020. And resource mobilization and fundraising was also identified as a priority capacity building area in the 2020 SMO report. So we felt that it was important to investigate this further in the context of the pandemic. We found that despite significant ongoing financial uncertainty, SMOs have nevertheless demonstrated their resilience. And in fact, some SMOs are even thriving. So of course, SMOs have experienced funding losses and there's still a lot of uncertainty about the future. But last summer when we were conducting the survey and when we were conducting interviews last summer, we were hearing widespread concerns about SMOs going under altogether or the potential for organizational mergers. And we looked for evidence of this, 9, 10, 11 months in. And we found that SMOs are surviving, and in some cases, not all, but some cases even thriving despite facing significant financial challenges. What are the reasons for this? SMOs have strong relationships with their communities. They have loyal and generous donors who have continued to support them through the crisis. We also found that SMOs have intentionally adapted their strategies. They have pivoted some of their fundraising activities online. They have diversified their funding sources. And some of them have even made more fundamental long-term transformations to their business model. And so the report goes into some detail about what some of these strategies look like. The second thematic area was related to program development and adaptation. And again, this was another priority area, capacity building priority area in the 2020 SMO report. And it was a major theme in our initial research from the summer of 2020. So we found that SMOs have found creative ways to adapt and innovate in their program delivery. Prevalent strategies related to program adaptation included, not surprisingly, online pivots, but also focusing on core competencies. And sometimes this focus on core competencies has led SMOs to venture into entirely new program areas. And then finally, also forming new collaborations. There was also just some discussion amongst many of our participants, however, that despite the prevalence of online pivots, there are still important concerns about the limitations or challenges of working online. And these challenges and limitations are related to the digital gap, accessibility and inclusion, and wellness. So with regards to the third finding, the third thematic area was gender-based pandemic response. And again, integrating gender equality into programming was a priority area from the 2020 Spur Change report and was an important theme in the earlier research. Our earlier research found some concerning trends related to the pandemic's impact on gender-based programming. We found that a significant number of SMOs working in gender equality and maternal health had to suspend their programs as a result of the pandemic. This suggests that the pandemic has had a double impact on gender equality. It has both damaged historical progress that has been made in these areas, as well as negatively impacted the ability of SMOs to address gender equality issues. We found, perhaps unsurprisingly, that SMOs with prior experience in gender equality programs have greater capacity to respond to the pandemic's gendered impacts. We also found that SMOs have tended to adapt pre-existing gender equality programs to the pandemic rather than implement new programs. The fourth thematic area is related to localization and relationships with local partners. We found that local partners have contributed significantly to SMO resilience, and there's also evidence that the pandemic has accelerated the localization process. So prior to the pandemic, many SMOs exclusively implemented their programs through local staff or partners. The prior existence of these strong relationships has contributed to the resilience of SMOs, as well as their ability to adapt their programs quickly to the pandemic context. We also found that the process of localization has been accelerated in a number of ways by the pandemic. Because of the global shift to a remote working environment, local staff and partners are able to participate more regularly in staff meetings that they might not have attended previously. And so therefore being able to participate more frequently and consistently in decision-making contexts. Other indicators of localization include the repatriation of international staff, new locally led programs, and new local partnerships. However, limited international mobility remains a source of concern and uncertainty for the future, particularly in relation to monitoring and evaluation activities, and there are still some significant barriers to localization. Finally, the fifth thematic area identified variations in SMO pandemic response. We found that the most salient variations across Canada's SMO sector relate to organizational size, regional location, and geographic areas of work. Now, in terms of size, we found that SMOs of all sizes across the sector are flexible and nimble. However, there are important differences related to capacity between the small organizations and the medium organizations. Prior to the pandemic, medium organizations had greater capacity compared with small organizations in terms of their ability to submit funding applications, and were also more likely to receive federal funding through GAC or FIT. There are also important variations related to an organization's location in Canada, as well as geographic areas of work. I see that we're probably out of time, but I'm happy to discuss that further. The report ends with some lessons learned, some best practices and recommendations that I'm also happy to discuss after. So thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Well, you're good on time. You're only 1 minute over, so we're not behind. That's fine. Thank you so much, Andrea, for presenting the highlight. And you will see in the report that we kept a lot of SMO stories, so direct quote from the interviews where you will hear what SMOs have been sharing on those different teams. My next question is for Lynn Thornton from VIDEA. So Lynn, VIDEA has worked hard to intentionally apply feminist principles to its pandemic response. Can you provide some example of what this has looked like for the organization and what kinds of adaptation you made?
Can, Andriane, and thank you to everyone who's organized this conference. I'm joining you today from the traditional unceded territories of the Wasanich people on the southern part of Vancouver Island, and it's so sunny today in this beautiful part of the world that I actually can't see my notes, so bear with me. So when I think back to the start of COVID, as an organization, we were already 2 years into an intentional process of organizational decolonization. And what had fallen from, one of the things that had fallen from that process of decolonization was the acknowledgement of a need to redefine and restate what our feminist values are to us. So before I talk about how we applied our feminist values, I'm first of all going to tell you what those feminist values are. So as an organization, our feminism will challenge and shatter everything that we've accepted as normal. To us, feminism is decolonized, indigenous, intersectional, brave, and anti-capitalist. Our feminism meets people where they are. It is dynamic and transforming. Our feminism is not business as usual. It's about challenging existing oppressive ideas, norms, and structures, and shifting paradigms, power, and knowledge systems. Our feminism is about hearing and amplifying different voices, radical voices, voices that do not fit within a capitalist, patriarchal, colonial system. Our feminism will be resilient. Our feminism will challenge us at our roots. Our feminism will make us uncomfortable. Our feminism will make us stronger. So I hope that you can recognize these values in what I'm about to share and how they have made us stronger. The first thing that we did was to step back firmly and intentionally into our organizational values. We decided that if we were going to go down during COVID, we would go down together as a team and we would go down fighting. We realigned and we increased our programs, but we didn't cancel anything. And we prioritized people. And that is the most important part of this. We prioritized those people and positions in the organization who were most vulnerable and most likely to be feeling insecure. And this included shifting some overseas staff to work on Canadian aspects of programs. We focused on applying for employment-related funding to be able to shift program participants onto our team so that they could come out of COVID stronger. During this year, our team has increased from 18, our staff team, to 30. We worked hard to create a safe space within the team. We made an immediate shift away from talking about work in team meetings and focused instead on learning more about each other and our needs. Because we have a really diverse team, this helped us to better understand how COVID was impacting different sections of our society and countries and informed and improved our work. To date, we've dedicated more than 1,500 staff hours to meeting and sharing twice a week, sorry. As a result of that, we increased our work on decolonization, reconciliation, anti-racism, and against digital hate. We also treated people as individuals and really focused on this. We met people where they needed to be met, provided people individually with the support that they needed that went a long way beyond providing flexible working hours. We encouraged people to feel comfortable bringing their emotions into all aspects of the workplace. We turned up for our Indigenous partners, sourcing funds to intensify our relationships and provide the support that they need at this time. We took advantage of new, more accessible digital spaces to create opportunities for young women to lead and to share their voices in different forums. We encouraged all team members to be heard in the way that they want to be heard and to speak truth to power. And lastly, we engaged our wider community through a storytelling hour. We started a weekly public engagement storytelling hour in the first week of our isolation of COVID. And we did this to engage our wider community to address isolation and loneliness and to provide an opportunity for our community to convene weekly and to share their own stories, performance art, and emotions in a safe environment. And we're coming up to our 52nd weekly storytelling event next Monday.
Thank you so much, Lynn. This is very powerful, and I'm sure a lot of us will be very impressed by how you apply your feminist principle into your organizational structure and practices. Thank you so much for this. My next question is for Shanna Novak, who is with CISEPO, the Canadian International Scientific Exchange Knowledge. So Shanna, CISEPO transformed its financial models during the pandemic. So what did you do to increase your organization's financial sustainability?
Thanks, Andrea. That's a really interesting question. I think we could spend an entire session on that alone. But first, I'd just like to say that I'm so inspired. I'm caught between inspiration and exhaustion in hearing all the things that Lynn's been able to do with FIDEA and the restructuring and reimagining. It's extremely impressive. We took on a similar process, but very different. And part of that meant looking specifically on financial sustainability so that we could continue during the pandemic and also post-pandemic. And part of that meant looking specifically at how to reimagine and remake our nonprofit in order to better serve our constituents during the pandemic and post-pandemic. So as much as it was a time consumer to reflect that way on our financial models, we also found it really necessary to do that despite the constraints. So in terms of financial frameworks themselves, what we had to do is look at the financial models that would allow us to push forward and address things not just based on the status quo, but also on being able to deliver programs specifically. So not just the transactional nature of bringing in donors, so donor acquisition, acquiring new philanthropic relationships, but really generating a strong relationship with whether they're organizations that we deliver programs to on a cost basis, furthering and strengthening those relationships so that they would last long term, or really focusing on the impact of our programs and communicating that the impact of our programs so we could create somewhat of I call it a virtuous circle, where we're able to align our capacities and the impact and bringing together the existing relationships and the infrastructure in order to demonstrate the impact that we deliver to the partners and the benefits of that, and then continue within a circle so the funding continues. One example of that is that we really focused on, when I talk about the capacities, we had the capacity to use our digital infrastructure, digital platform, and CPD programming, so continuing professional development programming in areas like anti-racism and reducing implicit bias, and anti-hate programming to address essential health equities here in Canada and also overseas. So focusing on both localization and globalization, and deliver certain aspects or certain elements of those programs on a for-cost basis, and then take those funds and direct them into the broader programming that we needed to do that would be otherwise unfunded. Then it would turn it into a long-term sustainability plan, because there's continuing demand for those types of programs from partners that wouldn't be able to pay for us to deliver them. And then the ones that wouldn't be able to, our primary constituents, our beneficiaries of our program, would be able to receive without cost, any financial barrier, the programming that was of most value during the pandemic, and we'll continue to tweak that going forward. We wanted to look at long-term sustainable revenue strategies that produce the types of flexible income that allowed us to leverage our organizational capabilities, like delivering these programs usually using virtual and digital modalities, and being able to tap into medical schools and schools of public health and experts within a global knowledge transfer network. And we tried to overcome some of those restrictions with a model that built in an intentionality to what we were doing and a specific focus. So making certain that nothing that we were doing was transactional in any way. It was all based on intentionality and focus, authentic and deep relationships with trusted partners, those who were able to do sort of almost a social philanthropy or a social impact investment model, but not necessarily using investment tools per se, but those trusted relationships to create an indirect social impact investment model. And that led us to be able to create these revenue strategies that were built on relationships and competencies, so that we were able to programming on even a larger scale, and one that properly compensated those within our team and those who participated in our programs, even being able to offer honorariums to participants in our programs who would be otherwise facing housing insecurity and food insecurity, and other obstacles to participation, and doing so based on relationships and competencies and leverage those within this particular financial model.
Thank you so much, Anna. This was so interesting, and this is the way that you were able to shift and able to scale up was a very good example of within the study that Andrea was pointing out, that this is one of the reasons why we wanted you to come here, because it seems like a very successful story. So thanks for that. My next question is now for Wendy Fair, who is with Cause Canada, an SMO based in Alberta. So when we were talking with Andrea, she was telling me that some organizations like CAUSE were able to adapt to the current pandemic by applying its learning from the Ebola crisis. And we thought it was a very interesting perspective. So can you share with us some of the key learnings that you used from the previous crisis that you applied to your work for the current pandemic, and how it increased those learning, how it increased your resilience?
Thanks, Andriane. So first of all, I want to start by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, including Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai nations, and then the Stoney Nakoda nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina Nation. So if you know me, I think most people, there's quite a few people on the call that actually do know me, and they know that I actually wasn't with CAUSE during the Ebola crisis. I came to CAUSE in 2016. But CAUSE was very active in Sierra Leone during the Ebola crisis, responding to the crisis there and working with communities to help create a prevention and response in the communities. So when at the beginning of March and kind of around the time where the pandemic really became evident to all of us, I started to talk with our country director in Sierra Leone and said, you know, if we have to respond, if we need to do something, you know, can you write me kind of a roadmap of what happened during Ebola? What did the Sierra Leone office do during that time? And so he wrote us kind of a basic project of what they did. And then what we did is we took a really close look at what were some of those learnings of that? What were some of the gaps? And of course, as many people know, and I know there's a lot of discussion about this now, is that pregnancy rates went really high among very young adolescents. And then there was a large number of girls who never returned to school after Ebola. So years after, we were still seeing the effects of very young girls who never went back to school. And so, and of course, the increase in sexual and gender-based violence. So when we started to look at, well, what could we do as an organization, we took this basic plan of what we did during Ebola, and we workshopped it with all of our country directors, and we looked specifically at how could we provide some sort of a response in each area where we were working, and then how did we also integrate these learnings about girls getting pregnant and not going back to school. And it was great because we could really take that experience and contextualize it and you know, use the expertise that was in the field, knowing their communities, knowing the people who worked in and leadership in each of these communities in each of these countries. But then you know, we did things like we set up in Sierra Leone, for example, in every community we worked, we set up a girls club where we provided an opportunity for girls to come together, girls and young women to come together and to talk about SGBV and to talk about sexual and reproductive health. And this was a really exciting thing because we actually were hearing all sorts of stories about girls who hadn't gone back to school after Ebola. So then being able to connect them back to schools when the schools reopened. And then we did everything because we have some very large education programs in Sierra Leone. And so we just mobilized everything that we could in every different kind of variation about how do we really maintain school attachment during the time that the kids are out of school. So we have a group of about 100 adolescent girls who are going to junior high and senior high school and university. And we were able to redistribute tablets to all of those girls and create MOUs with their families, which I think was so important. And even with our kids in primary school, we went out and visited all the families and created MOUs with them to help them kind of commit to making sure that their kids were listening to the radio or accessing whatever resources we were able to mobilize for them to be doing schoolwork during the school day for at least an hour or two every day. And so just being able to build those relationships and help parents to create that space for their kids to be studying was, I think, a very important thing for us to be doing. One of the key things that we learned. In terms of resilience, I think one of the key areas, so for Guatemala, for our partners in Guatemala and Honduras, this was new for them. They hadn't responded to anything like this. And I think really giving them that opportunity to have kind of an outline of how do you respond to this kind of thing based on our Ebola experience, giving them that outline and then workshopping it with them about, well, what could they do? How could we support them? I think that was a very empowering experience for them. It was, you know, there was a couple times where they said to me, Wendy, this is all brand new for us. And then us just really being able to come alongside them and support them. And I think particularly in the team and putting resources into how do we make sure our staff are safe, or how do we make sure their teams are safe? How do we make sure we're really helping them to know we're here to care for you if anything happens, and we want to make sure that we are doing everything to protect you as you're doing these programs. I think it was a real capacity building. It also really brought us all closer together as an organization.
Thank you. Thanks, Wendy. We are a little bit behind, and I want to make sure that we have enough time for the conversation to hear from the participant. So I will continue with one question. I will invite you to provide a short response to this question. So what have you learned from your COVID-19 pandemic response that you will apply in the future? So what are you going to keep and bring forward with you, Lynn?
Thanks, Andriane. I think actually very much what I talked about before, the importance of values, the importance of having strong stated values, the importance of defining feminism for yourself as an organization. That is something that we'll continue doing as we move forward. We will continue increasing the diversity on our team and making sure that our team continues to fully represent the communities that we work with. So at the moment we have 36 staff, and 33 of them were program participants at some point in the last 17 years. And came to their staff positions as a result of being participants. That in itself allows us to reflect the views of those communities and the needs of the people that we work with, and that is so strong. So continuing to do that is really important. We're about to add another 8 positions we have funding for the next 3 years, and all 8 of those will be Indigenous Canadians, which will mean more than half of our staff are Indigenous Canadians, and that will help us to continue the decolonization and reconciliation work that we're doing, and that has guided us as much as our feminist principles, to be honest, as we've gone through the last year. And coming out of this, really intensifying the work that we're doing on anti-racism and online hate. That has been one of the real lessons for us during this time.
Thank you, Lynn. And Shanna?
Thank you. Yeah, we had a similar approach. Again, I think this, we could spend an entire session on each of these top questions alone. And it's really interesting because I think we can take away so many best practices to carry us forth for what we're going to face over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years in this sector and in general. For us, what we needed to look at was 4 specific things that would drive our reflection and reimagination. And that was looking at the impact of what we were doing. So assessing if we went away, who would it matter? Or who would it matter to and why? and that really helped us pinpoint what we were doing. So what difference are we trying to make on a small scale and on a large scale? Because even though we know what we're doing and we have our long-term strategy and a strategy that's bode well for us over previous years, things do change. And so we needed to be very flexible in understanding that the difference we're trying to make may be different now, but it also may be able to be embedded in our longer term strategy. And also looking at the impact that the beneficiaries and the constituents of our organization need us to have, because that impact itself may be significantly different during the pandemic and over the next couple of years as we work towards building back better, or the just recovery principles, or so on and so forth. And we needed to be as specific as possible to determine what the priorities are now and over the next couple of years, and guide that strategy, while at the same time understanding that the priorities that we identify in this process right now or over the past year may shift and will probably shift. And as well, being able to think creatively on how to engage our constituents in the process as well, so we can properly inform it on an anti-oppression basis and an equitable basis. And as well, not forget, when we're still on the topic of impact, to take stock of what the problems of the moment are and where we expect those problems to evolve to. So really falling in love with the question of the why, and bearing down on that, and seeing how the why can contribute to overall addressing the larger scale outcomes, and the principles of international solidarity being embedded in that as well. So the second thing was people, and making sure that everything that we were doing was integrative of the core principles of inclusion, diversity, and equity, and taking stock of all equitable practices that we can continue to include going forward, and new ones that we may need to be sensitive to, given the new demands on society as a whole and on vulnerable populations, even more specifically, who are affected to a great extent by things like disasters and pandemics and that type of thing. And seeing whether we could bring in new people to carry new competencies that we may not have within our organization right now. So the division, inclusion, diversity, and equity piece is significant, but also the competencies piece, and those two can be tied together when we're bringing people in. The third point was the finances, which I've talked a little bit about already, the innovative approaches to doing that and being flexible with it. And the fourth piece was assessing communities that our organization functions within. So having a really good understanding of what we're facing right now within the different communities and as a whole. And I'm tying it up because I know that I'm short on time, but looking to make sure that we're not duplicating what's already being done. And that's an awareness. So those four principles are the ways that we addressed it.
Thank you, Shanna. And now Wendy.
So I have learned so much in the last year. It was hard to really pinpoint what the key takeaways were for me, but I think one of the things that definitely came up was similar to what Lynn said. You have to know your mission and your mandate, and you have to make sure that your senior leadership team are also really on board with that. And I think that was one of the key things that was so critical to helping us move forward. We clearly, as a leadership team, have the same values. We know what cause is for and what we're supposed to be doing, and so that really galvanized us into action. Like it was so important for us. On a really practical note, one of the things that I learned, and this is really for all the SMOs, I learned that having a relationship with the Canadian mission wherever you are is really, really important. It is so helpful. And whether it's about money or not, it is just so critical to having that relationship, to knowing who's there, who might be interested in knowing about the work that you do, and how might you work together. And I know that, we already had a bit of that relationship in Guatemala. And then when we saw that we could work closely with that mission, we started to really reach out to the other missions. And it just really emphasized to me that, like, from now on, every time I'm going to on a field visit, I'm going to make sure I know who's in our Canadian mission. They're as passionate about the people that we're serving and working with as we are. They're easily as passionate. So they're there to, like, I think that's a really, really valuable learning for me, is to really make sure you know who's at the Canadian mission.
Merci Wendy. Je pense qu'à vous trois, vous représentez bien
Well,
des
the
éléments.
three of you are representing elements that we have seen in the report, so that the SMOs are really flexible, that they are really in close contact with the communities with which they are working, and they're value driven, and that their mission and mandate is clearly led by their values. So I think that you've remarkably illustrated these various elements in the report.